Modernization theory, that is defined as economic progress. Development is often seen as inevitable in modernization theory. That, as a matter of fact, in order to be considered developing, you need to be growing every year. A recession is considered less than 3% growth, for instance, in 2 consecutive quarters. So this is the view that we need to continually be having a greater gross national product. And is the view held by the World Bank, by International Monetary Fund. And we also call this neoliberal economics. So liberal means lots of different terms, but in this case it means a fair market. It means that the government's not controlling the market. It means that the goal is for people to enter the workplace. And so getting women into businesses, getting children into schooling so they can be involved in economic activities. Now, modernization theory, Woodrow Wilson, the United States president, he began presenting the notion that it is kind of up to the wealthier nations to help develop South America, for instance, in Africa. He was specifically concerned about South America, that in order for the United States to be secure economically and politically, surrounding nations would need to be developing as well, entering into the marketplace, so we become interdependent and therefore allies in the marketplace, but also just educationally developing so that there's peace and among our surrounding nations. So generally, the reason that a nation will develop those around it, why would Australia develop Papua New Guinea and put development into Indonesia? Why would New Zealand put development into Pacific Islands? Is because there's a sense that you want your neighboring countries to not have political unrest, to not have displeasure with their economic situation, because political unrest nearby can be a threat to your national security. So there's been a long-standing idea that the West should develop the rest. And that did become controversial. It was seen as paternalistic, and it does show that we have no amount of money given to foreign nations comes without strings. China is known as a large developer of other nations. It gives funds and jobs to other countries, but it usually comes with strings attached. Vote the way we tell you to at the United Nations, or somehow agree with our positions about Taiwan or whatever. So Keynesian economics suggested a trickle down view that wealthier nations, their wealth would eventually be distributed, but Keynesian economics looked more at the role of governments in developing, in directing the way that the marketplace works. So that's not completely free market view. It was a view that there needed to be intervention from the government to help the process help other people, because otherwise, there might be too much economic disparity between the richest and the poorest, for instance. So Truman as well, President Truman, U.S. president, also called for developing foreign nations and sending out foreign aid. And the U.S., USSR, China have kind of been in this development race of, in the past, in colonial days, the goal was who could control largest parts of the map, foreign countries, control the resources. And now it's who can control them in a neo-colonial way of, we're going to give you loans, we're going to give you capital, but how are you going to give us something back? So the strings tend to be still there. All right, Walt Rostow's 5 stages of economic growth. This is modernization theory. Was this inevitable progress, as I mentioned, that all countries were on the same trajectory of moving from traditional societies, like that picture in the comic strip back here of the the family living subsistence farmers in a traditional home, and that they would eventually end in this high consumption. So rather than every nation being deterministic on its own of how being self-determinative on what modernization looked like for them, in Rostow's view, it would all look like the West. Everybody would have this pre-takeoff phase where there was a increase in education, an increase in capital, an increase in interest in the marketplace, there would be a maturity and then a high consumption phase. So of course he listed modern European nations and the United States as the end, the ultimate goal of development, and didn't recognize a sixth stage or a seventh stage. And communists, Marxists would have said that, well, the next stage after this would be some sort of revolution and a communist economy. But how do you move up these stages? How do you go from agrarian subsistence farming to a developed or modernized high consumption mature nation, as Rostow would have described it? Traditional societies would need to have the preconditions. They would need to move from scarcity of resources to accumulation, and so there would be this fomenting sense of we need more. We need to enter the workplace. An example from Vanuatu, the nation where I worked. When everybody was subsistence farming, there was no need to enter the marketplace. So 90% unemployment was not a problem. Nobody was sensing a need to change their society. But then if you can create a sense of scarcity, if you can hand out mobile phones, and then all of a sudden there's a scarcity of minutes for the cell phones. There's a scarcity of cell phones, and how can we have more cell phones? Well, we need to accumulate more cell phones. How can we have more minutes on our cell phones? How can we have internet access? We have this scarcity. We need to accumulate. And so other markets began coming in and saying, yeah, people, we can sell sunglasses and blue jeans, but once people have one pair, that's it. There's no longer a scarcity. They feel like they have what they need. We need to create this constant need of needing more and more. And that would be the precondition for entering the marketplace, the takeoff phase. And then as capital enters and education enters the equation, people would enter this mass consumption stage. So Rostow's theory, obviously plotted what he was most proud of. The United States, Japan were up here in this mass production stage. He put China kind of in the middle, halfway up. China and India have moved into the mass production, the mass consumption phase. Many of these other nations have taken off since that time. Some of them have stayed in traditional society and not taken off. So Somalia and Afghanistan further back. Nigeria has moved up quite a ways in the past 30 years on this stage. And so some think that the whole idea of the stages is nonsensical. Who says that every nation should be heading to look like the United States? Who says the United States is the ultimate end-all be-all? So anyway, something worth talking about and something worth being aware of. What were the problems with Rostow's stages? First of all, this notion of unilineal evolution, that every economy would end up looking the same. And so also some countries didn't fit the pattern. What about countries that were heavy producers but weren't democratic, for instance, like China and Russia? Well, he just had to call them outliers. Well, maybe they're not outliers. Maybe they just demonstrate different trajectories of modernization. He has this position of hegemony and privilege where colonialism and inequality would generate something healthy in the end, a healthier economy. The question is, does a rising tide lift all ships? Is it true that the trickle-down effect works? A quote here: the trickle-down effect of modernization theory works when capital is infused in urban or industrial nations, but when efficiency and capital come to peasant settings, the patrons get richer and eliminate the peasant workers. And so that's the basic view of 1950s, 1960s, and 70s economists in the United States. Was the reason capitalism worked in some countries and not in others was that there was a more sense of human equality, participation in the system, right to land, right to private property, right to upward mobility, and therefore trickle-down economics works. But in countries where there's a patron-client system, like many nations in South America, the wealth does not trickle down, the education does not trickle down, people don't have access So there are, of course, critics who say, well, there's sort of a patron-client system even in the United States. Look at how certain ethnically marginalized peoples never have a chance to, to move ahead like other peoples. All right, we're going to move away from modernization view to a second view, which is the Human Development Index, a second view of what development is rather than just economic, gross national product. So the Human Development Index says, well, it's life expectancy, standard of living, equality, and literacy. These are the things we're going to take into the equation. So yes, gross domestic product does count. Economic output counts. That is part of human development. People need to have money to have access to food, to education, and such. But there needs to be a literacy rate, and there needs to be a longer lifespan. So you may have nations where there's a high gross domestic product, let's say because they're heavy in oil, like Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, other Middle Eastern countries. But do they have the other markers of flourishing, longer lifespan and literacy rate, or is the wealth being consumed by a very small group of insiders and others are marginalized or living, on almost nothing? So the Human Development Index, blue here, would be fairly high lifespan, high literacy rate, and high gross domestic product. And then the red nations are the ones struggling the most. You can see Papua New Guinea, Myanmar, Iran, and most of Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa especially, struggling with the combination of these markers. Okay, that's Human Development Index. Now we'll move to a third, dependency theory. Dependency theory argues that economies are not on the same trajectory, that capitalism is not the trajectory of Latin America, for instance. This, at a certain time period, maybe in 2020, that's different than in the 1970s. And generally sees that the global south, meaning less developed nations, less modernized nations, are typically poor because of colonialism, that Western European nations stripped the countries of resources where they colonized them and did not bring in the education and the self-determinancy to those nations, and instead have indebted those nations by providing loans with high interest rates. And so Wallerstein's capitalist world economy is a good example of this. It was the core periphery model that said, well, you can see on the next example here, some nations are at the core, like the United States and Western European nations, and the periphery were those who were continually indebted and were only seen as useful to the core for their natural resources. Let's compare these. The modernization theory would say that the problems in the global south, why is so much of Africa less developed, that those problems are internal. It would say it has to do with the way that Nigeria governs Nigeria, or that Angola governs Angola. It would say it has to do with values within those nations, capital within those nations, political processes within those nations. Whereas dependency theory tends to say the problems in South America or in sub-Saharan Africa are caused by someone external, by Europe or by the United States, for instance. In general, modernization theory appreciates international relations. It appreciates globalization. It likes the internet, the League of Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, NGOs, interdependency, because again, a rising tide lifts all ships, and it's good for us to be involved in the marketplace together, the flowing of resources, the flowing of education. Dependency theory generally is more insular and sees international relations as bad. Instead, we want to isolate ourselves off from the global economy. So high tariffs, taxing other goods coming in, closing the borders, and not bringing in outside ideas, not bringing in outside resources like books or news media or the internet. So nations have experimented with this kind of insular tendencies, like the United States, like the USSR and some South American nations in the 1970s and 80s. So the modernist view sees development possible with more relations. The dependency theory wants less relations. modernist view tends to be very linear and progressive, like Rostow's, and that would be true of the